Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being back here in time. We are running a bit late, so I would like to start our next session. If you could get seated. We'll continue today's program with another very interesting session, and that the session will focus on base infrastructure requirements. And the moderator for this session today will be Crystal Wilson. Crystal is the Director of Space Applications Programs at the Secure World Foundation. Currently, she focuses on the human and environmental security portfolio, which promotes improved governance and cooperation in the delivery and use of information derived from space systems. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Crystal.
Thank you, Christian. I have the pleasure of moderating this incredibly distinguished panel. Today we have sort of two goals. First, we will be identifying the base infrastructure required for operationalizing efficient and effective national space programs. And the second goal is to appreciate how to develop the appropriate skills and expertise required for the efficient operations of space infrastructure. So essentially, this is our opportunity to take many of the topics that we've been discussing yesterday and this morning and to dive a little bit deeper into those, to really look at one particular area, to talk and hear from several experts across national governments, industry, and academia to hear where they really think the needs are, what we can do to develop this infrastructure, and to build off, especially this morning's sessions, what do we need in terms of skills development and capacity development. Our first speaker and our keynote speaker is Pilar Zamora, who is the Executive Director of the Colombian Space Agency. She has a PhD in financial law, and she is the founder and head of Agencia Espacial de Colombia, a foundation of private initiative. She also has more than 15 years of experience in the public sector across a number of institutions. Pilar, if you'd like to join us.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you to the IAF Secretary and the organization for inviting me to this conference. For the Colombian Space Agency, it's an honor to be here to speak about the infrastructure in emerging countries. And more than infrastructure, it's a pleasure to know and to speak about how the experience with the agencies and with the states can help to build one good ecosystem in our countries. We start with the base of the infrastructure that we think that we require. This is our agenda. The Colombian Space Agency, how spoke Crystal, we born in 2017 with the purpose to promote the airspace industry in Colombia. But how we think that we can promote the space industry with projects. I think that it's very nice that for Colombia we can apply and we can resolve the social necessities, but with projects. I think that in the Colombian case we had 30 years in experience for theory and for speak about that this is one important scenario in Colombia, but we don't promote any special and specific project. And the invitation is now to take the skills and the experience of all the agencies for start to do. This is some of our action lines. How you know in Colombia we have the 80% of the land it's destined for the agriculture. So we start for AgTech and how AgTech and financial inclusion. We think that with the technology we can promote that the banks and the private sector move to our projects with technology and with satellites and Earth observation. This is some of our strategic partnership. Our strategic partnership are in the government. We are one private organization, but we have the government in our board. in our board how the agriculture minister, the defense of minister, the Department of Planning, and some other entities that now give experience similar to the French government and the Swedish government. We have universities, we have financial institutions, and we have international organizations that now give all support. We think that the technology is the tool for resolve our social problems. We have, when I say to speak about the technology in my country, my president and the ministers told me that, but why, if we have some other problems, some other big problems similar to illicit drugs, for example, illegal minery. We don't have, in some places, aqueducts. We have basic and social problems. And they say to me, but why do you like to think in technology? And I say, I think that the technology, it's the way for resolve all these problems. Because if we have one good application with the technology, we can resolve immediately many of these projects, many of these problems, and we don't need to wait years or years for the big infrastructure contracts that happen in my country. And we need to resolve and move on the way for the applications. So if we start to check what is the problems, the social problems that we have, I see that the way for resolve is the applications with the aerospace technology. And I say the applications and not research for now, because I know that all industry, included states and agency, development and discover many of these applications. I don't need to invent things or projects that now the world has. So for me, it is the moment to start to apply all this in the different problems, how the agriculture, in the telemedicine, or in the use of natural resources in Colombia. How the skills and expertise from the states and the agencies really can help to emerging countries. I think that it's very important, the government planning. But in the government planning, Colombia has many experience about try to build one good policy. But now we don't have one policy. And the reason is because ever you start to ask, but why a policy about one aerospace planning if now we don't have one special development in problems, in social problems? So I think that the cooperation with the states can help that we find the goals and the benefits. And when we start with the goal and the benefits, really we can go on in our career. By that reason, my invitation today is that there are different tools, legal tools, that we can promote in Colombia, and I think that is the same for the emerging countries, how G2G agreements, how integrate the private sector in my country. And with that tools, we can build one sustainable model. We can make a good policy, we can make a budget, and we can create projects with applications and with cooperation. I think that the tools are very important because we ever need how we can go on the way for really create the projects that we needed. And how we can create, I think that in the Colombian case, we have the ways in the legal part that we can do it. Look, this is Colombia. Inside to Colombia, we have the land for 17 countries. And in the past, from the center to the north, is all places that have one development. It's the big cities in Colombia, it's my city, Bogota, the coast in Colombia, but happened that in the south and in the east and in the west in Colombia, we don't have development, and the reason is because the past 50 years, we have civil problems in these areas. And in that areas don't have one good development about infrastructure, about roads, about specific and basic infrastructure. By that reason, we need now that in the past year, the new government signed the new agreement for the peace with the guerrillas in Colombia. We need to promote all these places for new cities, for agriculture, for the connectivity, because now, for example, we don't have internet connection in some of these places. So if you check how many potential in agriculture we have the 84% of our land for agriculture. And now we just use the 20%. And how you know, for the Inter-American Bank, we need how Latin America create the 38% of the food for the future. But now we don't use the land. So I think that with the technology and with Earth observation, we can really promote and start to do development in these areas. And more information about how many megadiversity is Colombia and how many water we have. We have the sixth position in megadiversity in the world. If I start to check, but which is my human resources, which is the universities in Colombia that know about aerospace engineer. And I found it that 9 universities has in Colombia programs for engineer. But it's amazing, but as 9 universities that now the students go and study engineer and don't have place to work. And the reason is because the industry now don't have one development in Colombia, and my students, the dream is go out to work in other country or in other industry, because in my industry can do it. So I think that we have the land, we have the human resources, we have the capacity for cooperation, and now we have one new government that promote really that we start to do one space infrastructure. What we needed? We needed all forms that now we know about infrastructure. We needed, of course, that constellations. We need communications, because now just the 40% of Colombia has internet connection. We need Earth observation for all applications. And of course that we need nanosatellites for the applications that now we can use in the land. What is our economical potential? Our economical potential is now join forces with the agencies and with the corporations. Because now we don't think in resolve our social problems, invented the new satellites or the new area in espacio. We need really to support with the cooperation, and we think that Colombia can progressive give one value to the different applications that now we can do in our country. By that reason, we start really with agriculture. And the reason for that in the Colombian Space Agency start with agriculture is because really we have many potential. And by that reason, we start with the Inter-American Bank to build this project for digital identity for the small farmers. In Colombia, the 70% are the small farmers, but the government and the private sector don't know who is the small farmers, don't know where is the small farmers, and we don't know how many we can produce any year. By that reason, I say to the bank sector and the private sector in my country, what happens if I, with the technology, with aerospace technology, with satellites for observation and for telecommunication, we can know all information about the small farmers. And I say to the banks, and the reason is because the south part in Colombia don't have capital for the credit, because the cost of the capital is so high. It's 500% the cost of the capital per year. And by that reason, I start with the banks, and I say to the banks, why we don't start to give and to promote the capital in the small farmers, and with the technology, we can create one ecosystem for that the small farmers go on and to be more productivity. And with the digital identity, we create all these applications that now give information not just to the bank, give information to the public sector about Ministry of Defense, Ministry in Agriculture, and the entities that give all politicals in Colombia for the farmers. My conclusions is that we need really promote G2G agreements, that we need really promote PPP, International for Development Space Project, but I need really structure a specific project with the international experience. I think that for Colombia, it's enough about the theory, and it's about enough for continue without the technology. Because now, for example, we have yesterday in my country happened that the explosion, one illicit minery that are in Cauca, and if we, for example, in that case, we have control with the technology, we can stop all this illegal drug and illegal minery, and we can't continue without the help of the aerospace technology. So by that reason, I think that it's so important that now we start to cooperate with all agencies and with all states, and I think that it's this is the way for our country, and I think that the way for the emerging countries. Thank you.
So thank you, Pilar. I think you hit on exactly what we were trying to address in this panel when you said, why should we spend money on space infrastructure, and gave us a lot of insight into how and why Colombia's approach to answering that question. If I could invite my rest of my panel on stage at this point. Great. So we have another large and distinguished panel for you. So we are going to try to move relatively swiftly so that we can at least get to a few audience questions before lunch. Our first speaker will be Adnan Alraiz, who is a senior director of remote sensing at the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. And so I will turn the mic over to him for his initial remarks as soon as we're all settled.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased and honored to be here to share with you a few words about our experience in developing the space program, space sector, and how we focus on the development of the first infrastructure when we first started back in 2006. So we have quite a short journey in the space. Since 2006, when we first started, we set our project and our program plans and objectives. And I think this is a very important element, as discussed earlier today, is to have a clear goal and clear objectives when you come and introduce a space program. And based on that, you will be able to develop all the infrastructure needed to support that development. In our case, we focus on developing the capacity, developing the skill sets. The human element is very important for us. And second thing, which is the know-how transfer, developing that knowledge and technology in the country. And accordingly, we developed our plans in order to achieve our goals. So the most important thing, as mentioned earlier, also the whole day, is the human element. People, people, people. This is very important, whether they are the leadership level, at the project management level, or the junior level when it comes to the engineers and the researchers and the potential scientists. We focused on that since day one. So we didn't build the infrastructure. We didn't invest in that. We focused on the human element since day one. And we did that through an in-depth technology know-how transfer program when we first started back with South Korea. And the success criteria for us wasn't basically the development and the successful launch of that first satellite. Even if that first satellite was failed, that wasn't a success criteria for us. For us, the success criteria was basically that the development of the human element and the capacity building. Having the infrastructure for fostering and sponsoring the talents and the skill sets needed is very important, as well as also looking into the existing market and industry in the country. We heard that the space is multidisciplinary, is highly subsidized. If you go back and look into the academia, looking into the industry, looking into the other government entities, you will find that human factor available, probably underutilized. Probably you can utilize those resources as well in support of developing your space program. I think it's very important that you have the proper infrastructure and mechanism to identify the human resources and include them into your space program and activities. The rest, the infrastructure in terms of the facilities, in terms of the operation centers, in terms of the other stuff comes at the later stage, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. I think that's a great point to start with in terms of it's not just about what we're building, it's also about who's doing that building. Our next speaker is Nivi Van Lanningham. She is the Asia Pacific Space Policy Cooperation Senior Specialist at the State Department. Nivi?
So I don't think I have anything new to share. A lot have been said yesterday and today on the point, and I just wanted to emphasize several points that my colleagues already mentioned. Sitting from a government point of view, working with emerging countries, I think one of the basic questions, again, Charlie Bolden also expressed it yesterday, is you have to know what is the driver of your space program. And that is, I think, the key elements to create a space agency. And you have many examples of countries that are looking at space agency in a different way. For example, South Africa already have been talking about how South Africa started their space agency by promoting having a interagency, a domestic discussion, and a buy-in of whole of government to create a space agency, and that is very important. For Australia, believe it or not, Australia been in space cooperation for 40 years, and they didn't need a space agency. They only decided to have a space agency last year. So these are all these examples that are different from working across the world on having space agency. I would like to mention one more country that is really a star country in Asia Pacific, and that's Indonesia. It's a quiet little country in terms of space activity, but if you're looking at it, I would encourage you to look at the Indonesia's space law that was passed in 2013. And in that space law, they came up with promoting space industry, and this is 2013. The US just came up with 2017. So there is a difference. Also, Indonesia started their space agency by looking inside, like India. The specific need of Indonesia was communication. So they started their space agency with communication satellite, and that's how it all started. So again, I cannot stress enough the differences in it depend on your country, depending on the need of domestic. And the buy-in of whole of government to create a space agency is a must. If you just have a isolation of a space agency without the buy-in of this Ministry of Defense, commercial, and many other agencies in domestic level, the question of sustainability of the space agency will not last. And I've seen that in many ways, and that I cannot stress. And then another that also my colleagues also expressed is the cultural part. You have many examples around the world talking about different space agencies with different countries, different government infrastructures, and the culture that come with it. That is very important to how you're going to get your resources, your capacity building, and the infrastructure for the whole space agency to go forward. It's easy, I believe that it's very easy for us to reach out to an international cooperation rather than domestic cooperation. And I stress again, reach inside first for your support, and then you can reach outside. You have to build a strong base in domestic support in terms of program and initiative and resources in space agency before you can reach out to the international cooperation. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nivi. I think you make an interesting point regarding the importance of considering cultural differences between countries in terms of thinking about what priorities might be. Our next speaker is Rei Kawashima, who is the Secretary General of the University Space Engineering Consortium from Japan.
Thank you very much for kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to this important panel. I am so happy to be here. I'd like to talk about how universities can contribute to reducing the gap between developing countries and developed countries. My point is use existing universities. Okay, let me talk about the Unitec global activities first. What is Unitec? Who knows Unitec? Several people know. I'm so glad. Thank you. Okay, Unitec stands for University Space Engineering Consortium. And we started this activity in 2002 in Japan. And after 8 years of working within Japan, we decided to share these activities with the rest of the world, especially with emerging countries. Because 8 years experiences was long enough to convince us this is good, this is effective, this should be done in any countries. So we are supporting and promoting practical space projects at university level. Unitec Global was established in 2013, and we are an international non-governmental, non-profit, very non-profit organization, and consisting of local chapters. Currently, we have 16 local chapters and 50 points of contact across the world. Let me share our vision called Vision 2030 All, which is by the end of 2030, let's create a world where university students can participate in practical space projects in all countries. No exception, all countries. You may think I'm saying something impossible, something crazy. But I want to remind you, just 70 years ago, when we started these activities, nobody believed that university students can build a satellite. But now, we see many students at the university that making their own satellites or talking about the mission of the space in the reality. So, the students also from the emerging countries. I heard several countries Ghana, Bangladesh, these countries' first satellite was a CubeSat made by university students. So I believe almost all countries have universities. If not, it's easy. We just establish a university at the country. Universities have professors, students, facilities, classrooms, and most importantly, they have a system to enroll new students every year. If they could be given opportunities to be vitalized and energized to become a space-faring university, then the university could be one of driving forces in the national the space program or the new space business initiative. Universities have functions of research and education, so it will be able to generate skilled people continuously without much effort, as education is university's duty. Let me introduce some examples of our activities which could help energize the university's professors and students. The one example is hands-on training of basic satellite technology, which is called HeptaSat training. We'll hold a course for the future instructors of HeptaSat in August in Japan, and the application due is March 15th, so we are still accepting the applications. Participants are expected to teach their own students in their home countries after the training. We will also conduct a 6 mission idea contest to offer opportunity to design the space mission. Everybody, not only students, can participate without cost, no need cost. This year, we will organize a competition using the experimental platform on the IS International Space Station in cooperation with 2 companies. One is Ice Cubes that uses ESA experimental module, which is inside of ISS, and Space BD that uses JAXA module attached outside of ISS. Both companies have a booth in the exhibition there, so please visit and ask them what's the requirements of the experimental platform if you wish. We organize annual meeting to offer an opportunity to get together. This year, the 7th Unitec Global Meeting will be held at the University of Tokyo, Japan, in November 30th to December 3rd. For the first time after organizing it in Europe for 3 years. Last year, we organized it in International Space University in Strasbourg. Thank you very much. We are also aware of the importance of education on debris mitigation issues, especially for satellite developers and users. In cooperation with the International Academy of Astronautics, IAA, a handbook for the post-mission disposal of satellite less than 100 kilograms will be available on the IAA website soon, I hope. It's free of charge. And so when it's ready, please download it. Based on my experience with Unitec Global and students and professors, I am strongly convinced that it would be a good idea to involve universities as a part of infrastructures to generate highly motivated, skilled people in a sustainable way. Students will become a driving force to make good changes happen. Again, all countries already have good seeds in their universities. Just give them water and sunshine. Then all of us will be supplied in 2030. I hope the difference or gap, at least at the educational level, will be reduced dramatically. To conclude my talk, I'd like to share an African proverb that always inspires and encourages me. Maybe African people knows that. If you want, go faster, go alone. But if you want, go farther, go together. Space is infinite, and we can go farther and farther if we decide to go together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Ray. You also had a poll question for the audience. How many countries will support practical space education in 2030? A bit of a predictive, forward-looking question. And I will say that the top two answers are less than 50 and 50 through 99. So no, not very many people picked the top two choices. Would you agree with that?
Of course not.
All right, our next speaker will be Agnieszka Lukaszek, the Senior Director of European Affairs for Planet. Agnieszka?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also happy to be on a panel which is actually dominated by women, which is not a typical thing in a space sector. So I always think about this. You know, we're trying to tell people how to do space, yet we cannot still figure out the diversity, inclusion issues. Perhaps we should work on that as well. But very good job putting this panel together. So yeah, my name is Agnieszka and I work for Planet. How many of you know what Planet is? Quite a few people, good. But I see like quite a few do not know. So I'll just give you a really quick overview because I think Planet's story is very useful for this panel. So Planet is a company, Earth observation company, that was created only a little bit over 7 years ago. So not so long ago. And we now have the largest constellation of satellites in the world. We have launched over 300 satellites. We have right now about 180 operational satellites. And we are an only entity right now that is able to monitor every place on Earth every day. So we have a daily revisit time, and we have launched a mega constellation of CubeSats, and that's a space infrastructure, and that was done only in 7 years. So if you can see an idea growing into this sort of company and a mega constellation in such a short time, it really demonstrates that if there's a will, there's a way, and there's a lot of things that can be actually done. But going back to the topic of space infrastructure and kind of the space programs and how do you actually make space activities and space initiatives in the emerging space states, the question is not, I mean, the answer would not always be to have a space agency. Space agency is not really an answer to your problems. It should be a tool. So I know quite a few countries, I'm not going to name, where there are space agencies, often small, often underfunded, and often useless. And you don't want that. So as was said before by previous speakers, first identify what you really, what your needs are in your country or in your region. Is there, and if those needs can there be met by space technology? The answer often would be yes. If there are space assets and space tools out there that could be procured, because perhaps it's not necessary, essential for you to spend money on building rockets or on building satellites, but perhaps it would be much more efficient to procure data, to procure service, to procure application, so that immediately your end users in your country can actually benefit from that. So it's very important to don't do space for the sake of space. Do space for the sake of your citizens and for the sake of your the needs of your country. Because right now, as we've been hearing, space technology can really help many issues. We have actually done this study at Planet where we looked at sustainable development goals, And it looks like 13 of the 17 SDGs can actually be helped with Earth observation alone, one way or the other. So that's a lot of different issues, right? That can be helped with, and you have to think about what's the best way to go forward. So one thing is identify your needs, identify your resources. What is your budget? What can you actually feasibly do? Right, because if you have a really good case, you know that to have a space program, you need to have funding. In order to have funding, you need to have politicians that agree with your mission. In order for politicians to agree with that, they need to have citizens that actually approve the kind of direction the country is going forward. Because a lot of people think, why would you spend money on space? It's so expensive. So you need to make a case that space is actually useful, that your taxpayers' money is going to something that is actually benefiting them in a direct or indirect way. So also learn how to communicate space. We're not very good at communicating. We're talking about space. We're talking about very techie things that we get very excited about that often mean very little to decision makers or to regular citizens. So it's very important to make a good case for what space can actually do for the country or for the region or for your citizens. And if you decide to build a satellite or satellites, and you decide to operate assets in space, make sure you are a responsible space actor. We have to protect the space environment. It's very fragile. There's more and more of us that are operating in space, and we need to make sure that in order to have benefits of space for a very long time, we protect that environment. So we don't want to do to the space environment what we have done to the oceans. Let's learn from that. Let's not repeat from that. So don't just shoot things into space so that you can say that you launched a satellite. Actually do it in a responsible manner. Look at your policies, look at your laws to make sure that actually you have a framework in which you can operate, and really be wise about this sort of investment, because it's a big investment. And I think it's also it's a good position to be in as an emerging space state, because you can learn from the mistakes of others. So and that's not a bad thing. You can see what worked for other countries, what did not work. What are the niches where you can really deliver and make a case out of. You want to support your industry in your country. So look at what the expertise is in your country. What are the types of businesses and talent that you have in your country that can actually grow and scale up to companies to profitable companies, so that the economy is also your space activities are also contributing to the economic growth. So it's a big ecosystem, right? Like let's not just I always say, space program, it doesn't necessarily equal space agency. And I'm not against, of course, creating space agencies, but don't just do it just to tick that box. Do it because you have an idea how it can serve your purposes in your country. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Agnieszka, for your thoughts on how to begin the process of prioritizing what might make sense in a particular given situation. Our next speaker is Ndiso Amelia. She is the Managing Director for Earth Observations at SANZA from South Africa.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think for me, I would like to start with the why. What is our why? Making informed decisions. In our personal lives, we want to know, what must I wear today? I ask myself that question every morning. What is our business? If I were a farmer, I would ask, when should I plant? And if I was in government, I would like to answer questions like, where should I build the next school that is required in my community? And also, if we look at our own value chain as the space community, from observational requirements to satellite build, all the way to the products and services being made available, this whole chain is information driven. We build satellites because we want to observe. We observe because we want information. So for me, one of the fundamental infrastructures or base infrastructures that we need to be considering is data. For the emerging countries, for the National Space Program, we can consider that we start sometimes wanting to jump to actually building satellites rather than actually looking at establishing a data technology drivers, as well as data governance strategies that enable the countries to be smart and productive users of already existing satellite data. For me, this is the quickest and the most efficient way for showing value proposition for your national space program. It actually makes the money come quicker because you actually now have a user-based community that trusts on the product that you've developed. It is also a low-hanging fruit if you start focusing on what can you do with the data that's already out there. The global space community has made sure that we have the base infrastructure, if you think of data as such, and that this infrastructure already exists. Planet just told us of how many satellites they've got in the constellation. And great progress has also been made in making sure that this data is accessible. So here we would look at the initiatives that are done by the Group on Earth Observations, which started decades ago, looking at making sure that we've got open access to satellite data through their data sharing principles. Today, we've got movements on open data throughout the country, looking at all sectors. So now we know that we don't have the hindrance that we used to have before in accessing the data, which was primarily the cost of the data. There are a number of sensors that have their data sets made freely available that one could actually start building an effective program on. Whether we're talking Landsat, we're talking Sentinel, CBAS data, even some of the privately owned data set, which is what France has done with the Sport 1 to 4 through the Sport World Heritage Program. This is the low-hanging fruit that I'm talking about, because this you do not have to spend any money any longer to actually start tapping the value of. Of course, we have another challenge. Now that we can actually do not need to buy this data, we have the challenge on how do we actually build the appropriate technologies to make sure we can actually get the data. So bandwidth side is also the case, because some of us still disseminate the data using hard drives today in this age. So we cannot give our data without putting it on a hard drive. The fourth industrial revolution technologies are also some of the technologies that come to mind. There is an argument, of course, when we talk about fourth industrial revolution, that data is the new oil because of the value that it actually brings to the digital economy. However, there's a difference between the data and oil, because data is replicable. There's such an abundant supply of data in so many sectors. We cannot say this about oil. So therefore, one can actually say that data is much more valuable in today's economy than oil is. But when it comes to fourth industrial revolution, we also say that data is viewed as the oxygen, because data is in the center of the fourth industrial revolution. Whether you're talking about artificial intelligence or machine learning or some of the soft computing aspects of the fourth industrial revolution technologies, none of these can actually take us any further if data is not seen as being in the center of that. For emerging countries, actually for the globe wide, we have to also note that where the most impact of fourth industrial revolution is going to occur is in the emerging countries. Because the developed countries have actually had these technologies and they've explored the data. They've been able to put decision support tools in place, whereas for emerging countries, we're still lagging behind. According to the World Economic Forum, Africa and the Middle East will experience higher cloud computing traffic expansion than any other market in the world between 2016 and 2021. Here, they're looking at a compound annual rate of 35%. So SANSA has an archive dating back to the 1970s, over 30 years of data. We're talking over 1 million satellite imageries that cover the whole of South Africa. In the past 12 months, we've distributed nearly 60,000 imageries. These have been distributed to government departments, the research institutions, and some of it to the private sector. We directly support 2 operational services, one on fire monitoring and another on vessel tracking in our coastline. There are a number, however, of once-off and ad hoc projects that are being done throughout our government and throughout the research community. But the question still stands. With a 30-year archive and having established a national space program in the country, why would we have such a little uptake on the Earth observations data? Why would we have so few operational products and services, and yet we have the data? Well, the cost, we've taken it away, but we haven't solved the issues around the technologies that enable us to actually manage this data, so that if you actually want the data, you do not have to come and bring me your hard drive, and I take 2 days copying the data over to the hard drive for you to actually get it. And then you also have to answer the question of, when you get to your own institution, how do you make sure you have easy access to that hard drive and you can process the data to actually have timely products and services available? So in this regard, we've decided to take some lessons learned on what the international communities and some of the partners have been doing. Australia has developed the Digital Earth Australia, which is based on the data cube technology. We've learned from this, and we've partnered with Australia to take more lessons and actually build the South African data cube. One envisages that finally, with a platform like this, we can start seeing the real value that's held by the 30-year archive of data that we have. And each year, we actually put thousands and thousands more of data into our archives already. And also, not to mention that such technologies starts to enable integrated data processing. It's no longer about giving our decision makers and our political principals information that's purely based on Earth observations, but we need to integrate not with just the space, but with in situ, and also with the socioeconomic data that's available. The challenge, of course, for emerging countries is the financial resources to establish such infrastructures. So how do you actually get to make sure that your archive is in a platform that is easily accessible, that has enough processing power to actually enable the development of products and services? And also, there's the human capital aspects of it. You need to actually know that you have big data and big data system experts within your institution. To overcome this challenge on our side, we've looked at a hybrid approach, where we're looking at using our own expertise, especially on the Earth observation side, the infrastructure that we have, but also look at what are the other government programs that we can leverage on. One of these is the National Cyber Infrastructure Systems, which includes a Center for High Performance Computing. The infrastructure has already been put there by government. And I know in most of the African countries that high-performance computing centers are available and they are underutilized. Each government will tell you that the CHPC they have in their countries underutilized, and the Earth observations community hasn't come in to actually tap in this available resource. We've also looked at partnering with the Square Kilometer Array team, because for astronomy, they've looked at big data processing and so forth. These kinds of partnerships enables us to fast-track our learning curve, but to also leverage on the most expensive component of such a project, which is the infrastructure on the ground. We're also looking at partnering with the private sector, because the private sector also holds some of the innovative technologies that we're looking at. But from a social perspective, whilst we put data as a base infrastructure, and whilst we're going to the 4th industrial revolution, we also need to be mindful that the governance strategies are very important around data. Normally, as the Earth observations community, we only focus on the data sharing policies because we want open access to data. But there are other governance structures in terms of that we need to look at to ensure that we have immediate gain on the archives of data that we have, but we are also mindful of the cultural diversities that we have, the geopolitics that we're dealing with in the space that we're in. Security and accountability is also another. And that the 4IR is not just used to increase inequality and discrimination and further expand the digital divide that the emerging countries are currently in. Thank you.
Thank you, Andiso. I think it was incredibly helpful to hear specifically about the infrastructure needs around data. We tend to think of infrastructure as sort of the large, big objects that need to be built, but that certainly isn't entirely the case if we're really talking about having space delivering benefits. Our next speaker is Jean-Philippe Duvall, who is the Francophone Africa Advisory Leader and PwC Relationship Partner at the African Development Bank.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here. So I'm based in Morocco and spend most of my time between Casablanca and Abidjan, working with the African Development Bank. African Development Bank is one of my key accounts. And I think we need to look at the I5s. Maybe some of you are familiar, others are not. One of the I5 is the Industrialize Africa. And for me, space industry resonates with this objective to industrialize and create more jobs and employment and GDP impact in Africa. So when you are working in emerging markets, and particularly in Africa that I know better, you cannot be only one industry centric. Basically, when it comes to infrastructure, where you have a lot of competition in infrastructure in a country, basically you need to have roads, you need to have bridges, you need to have ports, you need to have facilities for agriculture, and that entered into a competition with space infrastructure. And basically, unless you have a government that has a vision on space infrastructure is often seen as nice to have and not must have. So basically, to bring space as a must have, what it takes. I think you have answered one of my questions before it was, do you really need to be a space nation to have infrastructure? I think with the recent development in the technology, the digital, all the different constellation, you can disrupt the traditional approach. You can still invest in infrastructure, in science, and you want to develop a program. But you can start in having products with no particular infrastructure. What I think is really, really key to develop your space program is to answer for governments and politicians and citizens two questions: employment and GDP impact. If you are in Africa, I mean, you have a youth generation coming, and you can build all your space infrastructure, but are you going to bring employment to those new students? And I think this is a really key centric question that has to be considered. So what it takes to build what I would say your business space infrastructure. I think we talk a lot of the space ground segment infrastructure, but how to build this business so you have employment, so you create value added in a country. Yesterday, we said to localize. I think this is a key word that if we want the Africa to develop, we want to industrialize, it cannot all come from Europe, US, Russia, Japan. There is a need also to localize the workforce. So basically, we create a sustainable space environment in Africa and in emerging countries. This business infrastructure is immaterial, and I think I've got 5 ways to do it. First of all, and it has been said, you have to capitalize on your natural resources. It can be forest, it can be also your education, and non-key industrial player. I think you have to try to build up on your new space. So how you create a space that is creating a business with the private sector. It can be from mining, from agriculture, and so on. Use your champions so they can buy your products and you create very quickly return on investment. Second, it has been said, is how to develop strategic partnership. You can build them at geographic level, Southern Africa, West Africa, Eastern Africa, North Africa, but also with international players, national space agencies, European Commission, the US, and so on. So basically, you benefit from the infrastructures and also the experience from others. 3, you have to leapfrog the existing market. Don't start with upstream and then go to the downstream. I think the leapfrogging is start with the services, and then you can build up with the time your different infrastructure. But once you show to the politicians that you create employment and you create GDP localized in your country, you will have those line of financing from the government, but also from banks that can be public and private. Then, and I'm almost done, this how to develop the business-friendly environment to attract investors, to protect the IP, to reduce the burden, to develop the startup. I think it's really key at the end, because you can do science, but also if you move to more business environment, I think this is what we see, this business-friendly environment, business-friendly initiative is not enough taken into consideration by the space programs. And last, I think it's a call also to the major space player in the world, is how you can leverage on your societal responsibility programs to build capacity, to localize, to create also new business models that are located in the different emerging countries. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jean-Philippe, for a look more from the financial angle of this question. Our last speaker is Adam Lewis, who is the Australian lead for Digital Earth Africa.
Thank you, Crystal. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be able to participate in this panel and to have the opportunity to benefit from the discussions of yesterday and today, and I'm certainly overjoyed to be on a panel which is diverse for a change. I come here from an Earth observation background rather than a traditional space agency. I work for Geoscience Australia, which is a not-for-profit government agency. We're an open data, open source organisation. And I'm going to interpret infrastructure broadly, as my colleagues have, as anything that needs to be reliably in place in order to allow success. I'll just reflect, I've really enjoyed references in this conference to the space community as an ecosystem, because in an ecosystem, every player has a unique role and a unique value. And I'm also encouraged by the references and speakers highlighting that many of the benefits of space lie downstream, pointing to that as an area for focus. And now I'm going to focus on Earth observation, because that's my background, and the data infrastructure that's needed to realise the vast potential that Earth observation has for countries and continents like Australia. In Australia, we have challenges in mapping, monitoring, and investing wisely in land management, in water, in agriculture, in natural hazard mitigation, in resources development, in the impact of mining, the growth of cities. In practice, whether an emerging economy or not, these are common challenges that call for reliable, explicit information. Yesterday, one of the questions up on Slido was, how can countries without a space agency derive benefits from space? And as my colleagues have pointed out, go no further than Australia. We're a major user of space, but we've had a space agency for less than 1 year. And you could argue we've done it backwards. We've demonstrated value from space, and then the government has said, well, perhaps we should do more in this area and have a space agency. So how is that even possible? And the key reason is that there's a layer of data infrastructure between space assets up there and benefits on the ground that is underdone and has traditionally been underdone. And that the solution to that problem lies both with the people who operate the satellites and with the communities that are driven to make use of the data. It hasn't always been the case, but nowadays we have sustained operational land imaging programs from the United States Geological Survey, the Landsat program, from Europe, the Copernicus and GMES program, and from the private sector, Planet, daily observations. These are global systems, and they create the possibility, as Jean-Yves Le Gall said, that every country can now benefit from space. Our problem is now actually how to use all the data. These observations are an incredibly rich source of information and completely unique. The observations are becoming more frequent and more detailed, and more than that, they don't go away. They stay in archives that go back 30 years in some places. So we have an amazing potential for information. But the part of the puzzle that's been missing is how to translate those incredibly rich sources of data into practical information. Now, everyone is invested in this problem. Whether you operate a satellite or whether you use the data, it is in your deep interests to see the system succeed and deliver as much value as possible. And that means that everybody has a role in the solution, from satellite operators through to users. And in recent years, I think we've really started to understand what that infrastructure looks like. It's not a pipe, it's actually a layer cake with a shiny thing on top. And the first layer is operational observing systems that are continuous, reliable, and provide familiar data. This is a tremendous contribution to the world and should be celebrated. And it's really in place now, but only recently. The second layer in that cake is actually open policies from government around data and pricing. And led by countries like Brazil and the US and the European Commission, these don't just remove purchase costs, they remove barriers to the flow and management of core data sets. These are a critical plank in the entire sector, both private and public, and to be supported. The third layer is less in place, is a work in progress, and that's accessibility to data. Getting these large data sets around the world and in a point where they can be rapidly accessed is a challenge that still remains. In Australia, I implemented the Copernicus Australasia Data Hub to deliver all the Copernicus data to Australia on a daily basis and to the region so that anyone can use it. And likewise, we have bilateral relationships with the United States Geological Survey to ensure that we have access to data. The fourth layer in this cake is more abstract and it's very current, and it's analysis-ready data. That the data that you take and have access to are actually prepared already to a level where most users don't need to take any further specialist processing steps before applying the data to the problem that you have in hand. So specialise in applying the data to the problem, not in being a remote sensing expert who has to convert the data into something usable. This is a work in progress. It's one of the most important international discussions spanning public, private and NGO sectors in Earth observation. The Committee on Earth Observing Satellites is playing a leadership role, and there'll be a real landmark when the United States Geological Survey released Collection 2 of Landsat in November or December this year. So they're the four horizontal layers in the layer cake, and then there's a shiny thing on top called a data cube. And whatever solution you take to this, our solution in Australia is Digital Earth Australia, we need structures that analyse the whole time series of information that is available, the full 30 years of data, the whole continent analysis, in order to really extract the information that is present in these observations and apply it in a meaningful and operational way across large areas and locally. These data cubes need to be operational, they need to be systematic, they need to be controlled by the stakeholders and connected to decision makers, one of the hardest parts. When they're built, what we're seeing in Australia is they allow coordinated continental scale approaches that draw actors together into a common decision space. We use the software called Open Data Cube, which we actually developed. That is the basis for Digital Earth Australia, and it's a free and open software. So the power of these data sets in Australia is going to exceed our expectations for government, industry and community. So, questions that we couldn't answer before. Is the coastline changing? We can detect that. Is a mine outside its lease area? We see that and we can tell you if it got there and when. Are our mangrove communities dying out? We can measure that. Are our wetlands getting the water that they need? We can tell that. When this infrastructure is in place, real benefits start to flow and it gets very exciting. So the key thing, the reason my title is Digital Earth Africa, is that very recently we've gained funding to take the Australian lessons and the lessons that have already been learned in places in Africa through the Africa Regional Data Cube and in South Africa. We've been funded through the Helmsley Charitable Trust in the USA and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They've jointly put forward funding through Geoscience Australia to establish Digital Earth Africa. We're in the very early stages of this. We're establishing government governance, we're negotiating hosting arrangements and doing our strategic planning. But where this will go will be to provide access to free and open analysis-ready satellite data across the whole continent. initially drawing on Landsat Collection 2 data, which will be released, as I said, in December this year, and using platforms like Amazon that may not yet be mature across this continent. It will produce routine, operational and continental scale products that are valuable for broad area analysis and for local application. It will be directed by Africa, for Africa, and it will be enduring. It will become a self-sustaining capability. My job is to make myself redundant quite quickly by establishing a capability that is ongoing. It'll produce open source products that can inform decisions at continental, regional, country and local scales, whether for government, business, NGOs or individuals. And most importantly, it will be aligned with other initiatives from global to local scales. So I will leave it there. We expect to have the first continental scale demonstration products of Digital Earth Africa at the Geo-Ministerial Plenary in Canberra in 2019, and I hope you will all be able to make it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Adam, for sharing this important initiative with us. As you all can imagine, I have no intention of keeping anyone from lunch, so we are going to keep our question session relatively short. I've been monitoring the poll questions as well as the questions from the audience, and I think I've got a couple that perhaps touch on a few of the various themes that are very diverse in many ways panel have hit on. And so my first question actually goes back a little bit to Andiswa's poll question. And so she had asked, should EO data be considered as an infrastructure that plays the same role in economic development like roads, railways, and telecommunications networks? Needless to say, in the audience here, we had about 88% of respondents who said, yes, absolutely. Not a surprise, and I certainly personally agree. But I think a lot of us hit on, well, what happens within governments and other organizations when we actually have to confront that question related to budgets and other government priorities? How do we communicate that? How do we make sure that that is something that we all understand, but that we need to have that conversation with a wider audience? And so I was wondering if a few of our panelists might want to talk about sort of how you have those conversations. What are your experiences in establishing Earth observation and other space infrastructure as a priority within governments who do have other very important priorities? Maybe we'll start with Pilar.
Okay, Crystal. For Colombia, for internet, for example, for the communication is really one priority, but now for the new government is one priority for the big cities. Now for cost, basically, we don't have this fundamental political for the farmers or for the rural areas. Now for the Earth observation, we have any applications for the airplanes and airports, ports, and any industries, but is not so applied in all country. I think that just telecommunications now.
So I can give you an example from our center. So when we started back in 2006 developing satellites, we developed a bit, as I mentioned, for the capacity development, not for the applications. But after launching these satellites and developing the applications and educating our end users about the different application usage of these satellites, today we have other government entities coming to us and funding space programs, coming to us and asking us to build satellites for them. They have no background in space, but since they knew now the importance of the space and the importance of the applications and what could be done using the space assets and space data, we're getting funding from the other sources. I think it's very important to educate the other side as well about the potential application usages and how this is relevant to their sector so that we get the buy-in and include them in the whole program.
I think for working with the emerging countries in Asia Pacific, I think one of the main reasons I would say is leverage your resources. And I can give an example again in Indonesia. So the government have stepped in and mandated the Space Agency of Indonesia, which is Lampan, to have the sole contribution of data, collecting of data and processing of data for the whole country. And I think that is a very good model of leverage your resources. Data itself is not cheap. to share it, to have one agency that will store all the data for the countries and collecting it and processing it for the need. And they have different fees, I imagine, for academic or for government or for private agency. And this is the model that I've been using across Asia Pacific. So right now, Vietnam and Thailand is using that model and trying to get the government to buy in, to have a mandate where the space agencies such as GISTA for Thailand and Vietnam is VNSC, to be the sole collectors of data for the whole country. And I think that's a very good way to go as startup, as an emerging country.
Anyone else? Okay.
So, first of all, I think, and this is a very important question, I think it's, we need to understand that for decision makers, and I think also for end users, it doesn't matter where the data comes from. Data is not what is important, the solutions are. The information, the application, the service that comes out of that data, that's what matters. So if you're going to somebody to sell the data, and I don't mean just selling actually, but sell the idea of using Earth observation data, you have to tell them why it's useful, right? So because they don't care where this data comes from. Does it come from a satellite? Does it come from a plane? Does it come from I don't know, Facebook, or whatever. What they want to know that they're going to get a solution that it's going to help the problem that they have. So when we go talk to these people, we actually shouldn't really be talking about Earth observation per se. We should be talking about solutions. So if you go talk to a Ministry of Agriculture, you look at the problems that ministry is looking at, and be like, look, we can give you this tool, happens to be based on Earth observation, and it can help you with A, B, C, D. You go talk to the Ministry of Agriculture, you adopt the story in the same way. So you have to know your audience. And this is, I think, what I was saying earlier. We space people tend to be too spacey for the general public. And we need to get away from that. We need to be really lead by example. So talk about specific cases, use cases, where Earth observation or space technology in general can be actually of help. And the last thing that I want to mention is what I was talking about, SDGs. As I've mentioned, 13 of them can be helped with Earth observation. Now, this is a solid story to tell. We just need to tell that story.
Great, thank you everyone. I'm going to take one audience question. I'm going to modify it slightly because it was a question that came in quite early. And it says, is the barrier to entry for space infrastructure too high? How can we lower it? But I think we've actually heard here that the barrier for entry for certain parts of space infrastructure is not high, and there are a lot of really important efforts being made right now to really lower that barrier. So I'm going to kind of flip the question, and I'd like to hear thoughts about where is the barrier to entry for space infrastructure still too high? Where are the challenges? Sort of what areas do you think maybe still are a problem? Adam, you look, go ahead.
I'll have a dive into that one. I think that the clear barrier is emerging, is in the skills, it's in the people. It's how do you have the people who can work with the data and the systems that are increasingly available at decreasing cost to achieve great outcomes. I mean, everything else can be, in a sense, worked around through good leadership. When I started in Geoscience Australia 15 years ago leading remote sensing, it wasn't a high priority. You can interpret that any way you want, right? But you can make it a success through clarity of purpose, through being innovative and looking for relationships, and for creating and taking opportunities. But the people part is now where we're at in terms of limiting factors. How do we skill people up, get access to them, and grow that human capacity that can really leverage the potential?
Great. Any final thoughts from the panel on this? Go ahead.
From a space industry point of view, I mean, you have a couple of barriers. So if you actually want to start a company, and I think that would be the case in every part of the world, and some is a little bit easier than the others, is of course the money, right? It's the funding. the seed funding, but then actually the seed funding is not so difficult to get these days because a lot of countries have and governments have different schemes and grants and where you can start a company. But the difficult thing is how do you actually grow? How do you actually grow the company where you can actually make an impact? And that's where you need a serious investment. So either governments or venture capital, and obviously in emerging space states, venture capital is difficult to come by. And the governments are much more careful in investing in something that might be risky. So I think this is one thing. The second thing is if you are actually a company that would like to put assets in space, the access to space is the biggest barrier. So for a company like Planet, actually launchers are that's the most expensive part by far of our business. And that's obviously, again, it goes back to funding. You have to have money for that. So access to space, obviously this is slowly going to be changing because, we're seeing more and more launch providers and small rockets and reusable rockets. So hopefully the price is going to be going down. But right now, that's definitely an obstacle.
Diso?
Just maybe to build on what Adam said, there is the level of governance that also needs to be put in place, whether it's within your policies and your strategies, and that's where you're answering the why. So, and that has to be articulated within the national framework. Why do we want to do this, and how therefore we can get to that. But there's also an element of coordination, and this is where I think most of the time we miss it, is that we do not coordinate enough at a national level. We do not coordinate enough with that which already exists so that we actually have one voice towards meeting our ambition for being a spacefaring nations.
Great. Well, on that note, I'm going to hand the mic back over to Christian.
Thank you very much, and I think this was an outstanding panel again. Thank you very much, Crystal, for moderating it, and to all the speakers for their contribution, and please join me in a round of applause for them. There is still one short comment.
Can I just make one announcement? Because my embassy in Rabat have sponsored 9 very outstanding women to come here and attend the conference. So can the 9 STEM ladies stand up for the audience to see? Please, hurry up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is just at the right time. I would like to ask you still to remain seated for a few more minutes because we are just now coming into another topic that fits very well on what you have just said now, and that is our IEF 3G IDEA Diversity Program. We will have a luncheon today after this session that will be dedicated to the IEF 3G Diversity Initiative. And I would like to recall the initiative which our president, Dr. Jean-Yves Le Gall, has developed as part of his IEF Global Innovation Agenda, namely to foster the principle of 3G diversity within the Federation and the space sector. 3G, you all know it by heart now, standing for geography, generation, and gender. And I think the composition of this panel is already a very good example that we are making progress and that we are at least on the right way. Not in all panels yet, but at least in this one, I think it worked very well. We've also created this IDEA platform, which is a platform that provides a framework for an intensive and open exchange on diversity and equality aspects. And we are very happy to have an introductory speech for our diversity luncheon today. And I'd like to welcome on stage now our speaker, who is an excellent role model for a young female space professional from Morocco, Vidat El-Kachradi. She's a student at the National School of Applied Sciences of Agadir. Mrs. El-Kachradi is a space camp alumni, and she's passionate about aeronautics and robotics, and she will tell us about the utmost importance of women's rights and how each of us can contribute to a brighter future for women from emerging countries. Vida, please.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to sincerely thank the Federation for giving me such an opportunity to stand on this platform with brilliant and great minds, and notably women as well. I would like to talk a little bit about myself and introduce myself. My name is Widad El-Kashradi. I am 18 years old from Morocco and a first-year engineering student in the National School of Applied Sciences. Ever since a really young age, I was passionate about mathematics and physics, participated in many Olympics, engaged in many clubs, and always kept updated with the latest news in the space or the STEM field. But somehow, my curiosity was never satisfied because it was just theoretical, it was just paper, they were just formulas. And I never had the chance to fully explore it until I had a scholarship to go to the space camp in the United States of America. And it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. We trained as astronauts, we coded mission simulations to the moon and Mars, we made rocket models, Arduino vehicles, heat shields, and all sorts of type of activities, and that was the closest thing I could be to experience what being an astronaut is. Later on, we went to Washington, and we've met with more astronauts and more pilots, but notably politicians and diplomats, that made us allowed to see that space is not just a scientific field. Space actually is something that is involved in economic, in social, and in politics. I came back to Morocco with a very straightforward purpose. I integrated in an engineering school and began studying something that I've always been passionate about. But unfortunately, the universities does not really offer what satisfies my curiosity in applications. They were very basic and dated. So I thought simultaneously with my engineering studies to work on personal projects. My first project was to build a remote control airplane. When I first put to plan, I decided that I wanted to make the parts of 3D models. I wanted to work with a certain complex and engines and things that were not available in my region, and certainly I did not have enough money to buy them. But instead of dropping the project, I thought of an alternative, another way to make this airplane that I wanted to fly. So I replaced the 3D model with thermocol that was very cheap, very accessible, but yet as efficient. And I've chosen to work with normal engines and propellers and rely on thrust derivation. And that was one of my very first humble experiences in finding solutions to resources, perhaps. And I think we can apply on that internationally, because we talked about how space is really expensive, but small experiences like these made me realize that there's an alternative if you are passionate and motivated enough. The interesting thing about my project is that a lot of my Moroccan youth peers were interested, and they were also interested in scientific and spatial fields, but unfortunately did not have the same opportunity as I did of going to the United States. So I thought about sharing my experience. It was peers, acquaintances, and then I was hosting conferences like these. Seeing how the impact goes further and further away from locally to nationally really inspired me to follow this path. And it was then when I decided to become a STEM field advocate for females especially. It was quite interesting because my first work was with the US Embassy. We visited elementary schools and we've talked to children, made math and physics super fun. And as cliche as it might sound, but seeing that little spark in their eyes and how little girls of 10 years old are telling me, I want to be an engineer, I want to be an astronaut, really made me push forward and made me realize so many things is that we are talking space and we are talking about certain fields that they sounded impossible before, but it's quite relative. Because when a country wants to socially and economically growth, it actually relies on its youth to complete the path that the elderly has founded before. That's why I then engage in the 4th and 5th SDGs, which is equality, education, and gender equality. Realizing these things of diversity and inclusivity in order that serves the country's economic growth just makes me go further. And the beautiful thing about integration to a space field, I've actually realized that we do not rely on hard engineering like aerospace or aeronautics necessarily, but actually software, robotics, and notably artificial intelligence is something that's very accessible, and it's something that we are using in the future. I've recently developed a couple of mobile applications using machine and that I discovered deep learning, and that is the thing that space from here to a couple of years will be using. So as we see, there are a lot of inclusivity, a lot of paths we can integrate in order to have this scientific career. One of my most passionate things that I've mentioned before is simultaneously with my scientific career, I would like to advocate for females, especially here in Morocco and from rural areas, to pursue their careers. And I was just recently selected to be a global change maker. I will be working this summer in Switzerland with over 60 international youths on bringing innovative, brilliant STEM projects to our country and applying them. Lastly, I would like to thank the U.S. Embassy for sponsoring us and give us immense opportunities as well, and for the Federation for hosting such a global conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vidat. I can only say that not always astronauts are needed to inspire the young generation. I think also your role models like Vidat, who gives an excellent example of inspiring people with enthusiasm. I think that's very important. And thank you very much for your work, and thanks for being with us today. Once again, thanks to the panelists here for the panel, and I would like to invite you now to join us for the IDEA 3G Diversity Luncheon, and we will resume here in this room again at 2:30. Thank you very much.
With that?